Ships of the U.S. Navy fleet, built prior to the mid-1970s, were floating asbestos traps. The fire-resistant, insulating, and nearly indestructible fibers could be found everywhere in a ship, in at least 300 different materials, some of them highly friable, meaning that the material could break down into dust or microscopic fibers, which then become airborne. The close quarters and sometimes poor ventilation increased the impact when asbestos fibers were damaged or disturbed and escaped into the air. A typical 4-year term of service set up a sailor for severe asbestos-related disease 30, 40, or even 50 to 60 years later. Among occupational groups, Navy veterans are one of the most at risk for developing asbestosis, lung carcinoma, and mesothelioma. It is estimated that over 30% of current sufferers of mesothelioma are either Navy veterans or former shipyard workers. Increased rates of mesothelioma cases have been documented in ship fitters, foremen, riggers, foundry workers, boiler makers, engineers, maintenance supervisors, pipe fitters, and sheet metal workers. The Navy was not ignorant of the dangers of asbestos. In 1922, the Navy issued a medical bulletin that put asbestos work in a list of hazardous occupations and suggested the use of respirators. By the late 1930s, corpsmen were given handbooks advising them of asbestos hazards. But the Navy did not enforce its own recommendations, and it did not inform sailors of asbestos hazards. Veterans interviewed 30 to 40 years after their service recall living and working in highly contaminated environments without warning or protection. Navy veteran James F. Murphy, diagnosed with asbestosis, served for 4 years in the 1950s. He describes asbestos being virtually everywhere, part of the heating pipes, air vents, and insulation panels, in the sleeping compartments, mess hall, passageways, gun mounts, and engine and boiler rooms. Every time the guns were fired, I remember tiny fibers would float into the air onto our clothing and bunks. Another Navy veteran, B.L. Kleberger, describes working in the boiler room of a destroyer, cleaning fireboxes and or blowing out tubes with rotary airbrushes would cause me to cough up dust and slag for days afterward. Nothing in the way of respiratory protection was ever mentioned or available to any of us doing these jobs, and complaining did not get you anywhere. Most of us used white handkerchiefs or rag masks as our only breathing protection. In the 1970s, when the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency began the asbestos reform campaign, the Navy was slow to respond. It wasn't until 1983 that the first Navy Occupational Safety and Health Program Manual was implemented. It applies to all Navy civilian and military personnel and operations ashore or afloat. The Navy Asbestos Control Program ensures compliance with the U.S. Department of Labor's Occupational Safety and Health Administration asbestos-related regulations. As a response to public demand that the Navy take some responsibility for the safety of its personnel, the U.S. Navy Asbestos Medical Surveillance Program was established in the late 1970s. It includes a database maintained by the Naval Environmental Health Center. Navy personnel are interviewed to determine their degree of asbestos exposure, and they undergo periodic chest x-rays. Information stored includes medical examinations and radiographic examinations. The data is periodically analyzed to look for trends in degrees of asbestos exposure and abnormal findings on chest x-rays. A recent study shows that for the decade of the 1990 to 1999, abnormal pleural findings seem to be decreasing in young and middle-aged male personnel, while the incidence of pleural findings in those over 60 years of age has not decreased significantly. This suggests that the Navy's efforts to reduce asbestos exposure are helping middle-aged and younger personnel. Older people, primarily veterans over the age of 60, would have had enough exposure in earlier years to result in the pleural changes now being observed. For these men, reduced asbestos exposure over the last 20 years would be a case of too little, too late. Thank you for watching. This video was produced by Asbestos.net, a leading resource on all aspects of asbestos and mesothelioma. Our priority is to inform victims about the devastating effects of asbestos exposure, mesothelioma, asbestos cancer, asbestosis, and other asbestos-related diseases, and to advise them with a wealth of information. Individuals whose lives have been touched by mesothelioma have numerous questions and concerns. Their caregivers and family members also need accurate, reliable information. If you or a loved one have been diagnosed with mesothelioma or asbestos cancer and need more information, we invite you to visit and explore the thousands of pages of oncologist-reviewed material on Asbestos.net, to call our convenient toll-free number shown below and speak with a mesothelioma specialist, or to use the simple contact form found at Asbestos.net to request a free copy of our informative books, custom inserts, and DVD. Asbestos.net. Information and help for patients and families.